Philosophers have the amusing habit of classifying truly complex problems under misleadingly simple headings. If, as is widely believed, the major problem in philosophy of mind is the problem of consciousness, it is so, we learn, because of something rather innocently referred to as the explanatory gap. Hearing this, persons living outside the discourse, so to speak, might be inclined to think that there's some slight missing ingredient which, once provided, will settle this enduring problem. Why, all we have to do is fill in the gap. I should begin this lecture, then, by searching a little more carefully to see what might be poured into such a gap in order to fill it, and what is on each side of it now that calls for a filling. The starting point is not the gap itself, except insofar as it puts some sort of space between, let's say, an X and a Y that shouldn't have this sort of separation. In the present instance, it's unclear as to whether the metaphor of a gap is really appropriate. We are told that it is an explanatory gap, but this actually begs the question. As I hope to make clear, those who employ the phrase would hope to suggest by it that unlike other common events, consciousness seems to resist location within the otherwise totally natural or physical ontological domain. That is, were we to have the right sort of explanation, we would be able to move consciousness from its currently limbo-like location to the secure precincts of physical things. But it surely cannot be only consciousness that is resistant to such a relocation. Virtually every expression of the aesthetic, moral, civic, and social dimensions of life seem strenuously resistant to translation into the language of physics or the natural sciences. Once real life enters into the equation, we seem to have gaps all over the place. I shall not quibble, however. Let us agree, consistent with the spirit of the discourse, that there is an explanatory gap and that we should expect that the missing explanation, once found, will not only fill in the gap, but will allow the terms on each side of it either to be collapsed into a single term or shown to be related to each other in some direct and unsurprising way. To be clearer on what is sought here, let us test some explanations routinely offered to fill in a gap between events we think require explaining. Angela leaves the house and drives her car to a shop named Marty's Pizza. Angela returns to her apartment carrying a large square box. 20 minutes later, Beverly arrives at Angela's carrying a grocery bag. We are now asked for an explanation that will render these two sets of events somehow intelligibly related. Here are some candidate explanations. 1. First, Angela and Beverly had arranged earlier to share a pizza and to talk things over at Angela's apartment. Angela agreed to buy the pizza, and Beverly agreed to bring a beverage. 2. Perhaps this is a better explanation. Angela and Beverly are tuned into each other's thoughts through a psychic network. Knowing that Angela has bought a pizza, Beverly also knows that Angela has forgotten to buy something to have with the pizza. She thereupon goes to the store, buys 2 bottles of a soft drink, and makes her way to Angela's apartment. 3. Well, we might instead fill in the gap this way. Angela came home with a pizza, and Beverly simply arrived at the wrong address and knocked on the wrong door. Now, how do we choose from among candidate explanations the one that seems just right to fill an explanatory gap? What criteria matter most as we set out to judge the quality of an explanation or its seeming validity, its aptness? Suppose we turn from a fairly mundane setting in which people decide to share a pizza to the astonishing setting in which astronauts are sent to the moon and brought back to Earth. How do we explain the success of that sort of mission? I refer here not to an explanation of just why it was that vast resources were devoted to such a project. That too requires an explanation. I refer instead to how we explain the very success of the mission. I think we'll agree that surely one explanation for the success of the mission is that the scientific laws on which the entire project was based are correct or true, in that if they weren't, the mission would have failed. So if someone were to say, what makes you think the basic laws of physics at the macro level are correct? One reasonable answer would be this: because we've gone to the moon and have returned from there to Earth, and we did all this based on the assumptions that our laws of physics are correct. In our mundane example, let's say that we know that Angela and Beverly are friends, that they meet on a regular basis, that they both like pizza, and this permits us to rule out explanations based on the assumption that Beverly arrived at the wrong address. And we may have still other and good reasons to reject the idea that they or anyone else is part of a psychic network. Now, in the matter of consciousness, where is the big gap in philosophy of mind? Many believe it's the gap between the dynamics of the nervous system and the nature of consciousness itself. If we were to sample the opinions of today's major philosophers, I would guess that the majority would expect that gap to be filled by some sort of causal law. On such an account, if brain states of type X, Y, and Z take place, these somehow bring about, in the causal sense of bringing something about, lo and behold, consciousness. But let's return to examples of the sort I previously cited. Jack is asleep, as best we can tell, and then his alarm clock rings loudly. We see that Jack sits up in bed, his eyes wide open, and he says, "Oh dear, I'm going to be late for work." He seems to have moved from the state of unconsciousness to a state of consciousness, and what we're looking for is an explanation by which we can determine what it was that moved him from one of those states to the next. One explanation is that he was awakened by his alarm clock. No surprise there. Others might want to say that the sound of the alarm clock stimulated his auditory nerves, which sent a strong signal to areas of the brain, and that through the activity of the brain, Jack was moved from an unconscious to a conscious state. His brain triggered the necessary processes. At the level of common sense, it's quite clear that the alarm clock or any other loud sound would serve as a very good explanation of what awakens someone. This would have been a good explanation at times in human history when no one even knew there was a brain. Suppose the example was the caveman being awakened by the sound of a rock falling. Pressed to explain this event, others in the cave might be inclined to say that he was moved from the state of unconsciousness to a state of consciousness by the loud sound of a falling rock. We might suppose that this account was given before the language of the caveman included the word brain. What we have here are candidate explanations, one based on the presumed functions of the human nervous system, and another based on the day-to-day experiences that allow ordinary people to form cause-effect explanations for events they've been able to experience frequently and make use of practically. Granting that causal explanations at this level are entirely useful, we might press on to consider whether a fuller explanation, a more meaningful and even more useful explanation, might be given by establishing causal relationships between neural events and conscious life. Even more boldly, we might press on further in search of explanations based on specific brain processes judged to be truer and certainly more complete. To defend this perspective, we might note the unfailing success of brain events in arousing one from sleep to consciousness. Brain events will do so unfailingly, even if there's no loud sound. Furthermore, it might be noted that were there no such functional activity in the brain, nothing in the external world could bring about consciousness. To the extent that this is so, we would then be prepared to say that explanations based on brain function are far more foundational than those based on the ordinary experiences of daily life. We would go so far as to say that with the knowledge of brain function, we can explain why the alarm clock has its effects, whereas no knowledge of alarm clocks as such, no matter how thorough, will provide us with an explanation of the effect they might have on consciousness. To know about brain function is to know what restores consciousness. To know about loud sounds is to know no such thing. Well, here then is one basis upon which to judge the quality of explanations. All other considerations being equal, the better of two explanations is the one that is applicable over a wider range of instances. Put a different way, the better explanation is the one that is more foundational. Explanation A is more foundational than explanation B when explanation A serves to account for the success of explanation B, but not vice versa. This is surely not enough, however. Terms such as mechanisms, processes, and states are really terms of art. I don't think those who speak of brain mechanisms really have in mind anything mechanical. Nor is it clear just what is meant by a state. After all, that word is based on the Latin stasis, which conveys the idea of something stationary or in place, standing still, features never true of a functional brain. And brain itself is quite a gross term for what in fact are billions and billions of interconnections among the neural units within the cranium. The units themselves are only units at one level. At the more foundational level, the so-called units are constituted of proteins, salts, water, these in turn being composed of various elements, and these in turn of atoms further reducible to subatomic particles. So to accept, quote, brain function, close quote, as more foundational than, say, loud sounds in explaining the transition from sleep to wakefulness, we leave ourselves open to the question, well, why not say instead that the cause of Jack's restored consciousness was a collection of subatomic particles in his cranium? The interesting thing about subatomic particles is that they're really all alike. So we have to consider them in a very special arrangement if we're to get to the level of cells at all. But not just any cells will do. They must be cells in the brain, and in specific regions of the brain. So it would not be enough to say that Jack was restored to consciousness because of activity in his brain. We would have to say that he was restored to consciousness because of activity in a specific region of the brain. This in turn establishes yet another explanatory gap. For we now have to account for the fact that not just any region of the brain is associated with the restoration of consciousness. It's really only this region, with this cluster of structures. Yet when we look at this cluster of structures, there isn't anything about them that seems any more related to the restoration of consciousness than any other cluster of structures within the same cranium. It seems that in moving to the most foundational level, we've lost all explanatory power. Even in focusing our attention at a more molar level, we still can't find any intelligible mode of connection between the mental state about which we have no doubts, namely consciousness, and some internal activity involving one set of structures but not some other set of structures. Might our difficulties be based on the possibility that we're searching for the wrong kind of explanation when we try to establish some causal relationship between activity in the brain and the mental state of consciousness? After all, not every relationship is a causal relationship. Jack and Jill are cousins, but they're not cousins because Jack caused Jill or Jill caused Jack to be a cousin. I would guess that one of the first lectures given in any introductory course in statistics includes the warning that correlation does not imply causality. There may be a very strong relationship between things, and nonetheless not a causal relationship at all. Well, this brings us face to face with a philosophical problem that's extremely difficult, quite apart from the issues of consciousness and mental life. I refer to the problem of causation itself. Thanks to Isaac Newton, we know that objects fall toward the center of the earth, and we have a term to account for what it is that seems to be pulling them there, namely gravity. We even have precise equations establishing the relationship between the mass of an object and its free-fall dynamics. In a manner of speaking, we can say that gravity is the cause of the behavior of falling objects. But this doesn't help very much if the question is just how gravity, or the force of gravity, has this effect. I mention this to make clear that this too seems to be another explanatory gap, and one obtaining between any number of paired relationships. The attraction between two bodies is proportional to their masses. But just why this is the relationship rather than some other is not revealed by the law itself. Just what is it in the mass of an object that results in, which is to say causes, gravitational effects? This is a question where the answers remain obscure. One of the most influential philosophers was David Hume, a leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century. His influence continues into our own time on any number of philosophical issues, especially that of causation. Hume is another in that line of British empiricists arguing that our knowledge of what we take to be reality is rooted firmly in experience. In explaining how we arrive at the very notion of causation, Hume insisted if there were nothing in the external world that presented itself, we could have no sense of cause. That is to say, we do not see or hear or touch causes as such. We don't see causes. So what then is the basis of our claim that one object or event is the cause of another? Hume's theory is that all such causal attributions are based on experience, and specifically on what he referred to as the constant conjunction of events. Thus, when one event is reliably associated with another in our experience, we come to regard the former as the cause of the latter. This is simply the result of how the mind is constituted, how it operates. It's nothing but a habit of the mind to treat such constantly conjoined experiences as causal in nature. Now, a small library of criticism has grown over the years in response to Hume's theory of causation, and this is not the lecture in which to explore the assets and liabilities of that theory. Surely those who regard the achievements in physics to be based on a grasp of how the cosmos really works will reject any notion of causality that takes it to be little more than a habit of the mind. One of the very influential contemporary critics of Hume's view is Wesley Salmon, whose book Causality and Explanation, which came out in 1998, developed and defended a model of explanation called ontic explanation. Recall ontology as the term applied to the study of just what really exists. Salmon's philosophy of science is based on the claim that science provides accounts of real causal dependencies, for it discovers real, that is to say, ontic, causal processes and events. This is obviously opposed to Hume. As I say, this is an important issue but cannot be pursued further here. Instead, we might allow ourselves to be just Humean enough to say that if there is a highly reliable relationship between events taking place in the brain, particularly in cases of pathology, and resulting alterations in conscious life, then based on the reliability of these relationships, and if only as a habit of the mind, we come to regard the brain events as causally responsible for the mental events, period. Our so-called habit here being no different from the manner in which it expresses itself in any setting in which we claim to know the causes of things, including physics. Now, taking this position, we might then comfort ourselves by noting that the explanatory gap existing between brain events and conscious experience is cut from the same cloth, to mix the metaphors, as the explanatory gap existing between, say, the mass of objects and their behavior in free fall. I say there is a comfort here, but at a metaphysical level we know enough to remain uneasy. The uneasiness arises from the recognition, however faint, that there's something special about the gap where consciousness is involved. A contemporary philosopher, Michael Tye, who has given sustained attention to the problem, offers a neat account of the staying power of the gap in the matter of consciousness. Let me convey some lines of his published a few years back in the journal Mind. There he wrote, quote, "Once one learns that in solid things the molecules are not free to move around as they are in liquids, one immediately grasps that solid things do not pour easily, that they tend to retain their shape and volume. Having been told the physical story, to ask, 'Yes, but why are things with molecules that are fixed in place solid? Why shouldn't such things not be solid?' is to show a conceptual confusion. One who responds in this way simply does not understand the ordinary notion of solidity. In the case of phenomenal consciousness, however, the corresponding questions remain even for those who understand full well the relevant phenomenal terms and who know the underlying physical and functional story. One who has a complete understanding of the term pain, for example, and who is fully apprised of the physical facts, as we now know them, can still coherently ask why so-and-so brain processes or functional states feel the way pains do, or why these processes feel any way at all. In this case, it seems that, as far as our understanding goes, something important is missing. Herein lies the famous explanatory gap for consciousness." Close quote. Well, I take this lengthy passage from Michael Tye not only because of the clarity with which he expresses the problem, but because he then rejects out of hand that there really is a problem. Note the title of the article from which this long passage was taken: Phenomenal Consciousness, the Explanatory Gap as Cognitive Illusion. Michael Tye regards the very notion of a gap to be illusory. He reaches this conclusion through a complex analysis of how various concepts are formed and then how they function at the level of our understanding of things. His argument proceeds from his own example. Take the visual experience red. According to physicalism, red equals brain state B. But as Michael Tye notes, this strikes us as unconvincing, for the very phenomenology of the experience, as Tye says, isn't captured by the right-hand side of the equation. None of the things I'd be prepared to say in describing brain state B will be anything like my experience of red. But on this point, Michael Tye points to what he takes to be a basic confusion, a confusion between the sense of a term and its reference. When we think of what it is that the left side of the equation is referring to, we just think in terms of phenomenal experience, red. We more or less picture red or redness, and in so doing we absorb the left side of the equation into the conceptual realm of things felt or experienced. That is, again to use Tye's phrasing, we bring it under a concept that has a distinctive functional role. Well, this naturally gives rise to a triggering of visual images of red items. But, says Tye, quote, "If the identity is true, our brain actually goes into brain state B," close quote. Note then that the sense we attach to the concept of seeing something red is different from the reference of the expression. Tye would have us accept the thesis that the actual reference of our phenomenological expressions just constitute states of the brain. In this, he joins an entire school of contemporary philosophers who no longer seek the means by which brain states cause conscious states. Rather, so-called conscious states simply are states of the brain under a different set of conceptual categories. If I'm not mistaken, the first one to employ the phrase explanatory gap in the way that philosophers now wrestle with it was Joseph Levine in a 1983 article titled Materialism and Qualia, the Explanatory Gap. If there is this gap, we still must ask whether it is a measure of where we have arrived in what is finally a work in progress, or whether it promises to remain just one of those eternally elusive facts of life, in this case, facts of mental life. To assume it is a roadblock of sorts faced by what in the end is the scientific community is simply to repeat confidence in the completeness of physics, confidence that the right ontology is a monistic ontology, and that under that heading, non-physical entities need not apply. If there are souls and angels, they fall within the pattern of real physical events, and thus are to be found somewhere within the framework of real causal relationships. To assume, on the contrary, that the explanatory gap is at once real and unable to be eliminated in principle is to withdraw from this very framework at least one feature of reality, namely our consciousness, which carries with it all the qualities that resist translation into ergs, volts, pints, and grams. I should think the final holdouts for preserving the gap against the all-embracing inclusiveness of science would be the poets. In this connection, my thoughts turn to two luminaries of Victorian England, William Ewell, and anybody who wants to know how you can get a pronunciation Ewell out of W-H-E-W-E-L-L must look into remote Celtic sources, William Ewell and Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, what, you may ask, have these two in common? Well, to begin, Ewell was Tennyson's tutor at Cambridge, and at a time when Ewell was widely recognized as one of the finest philosophical and scientific minds in the realm. In fact, at the prodding of Coleridge, it was Ewell who actually coined the word scientist, even as he influenced the thought and work of such scientific geniuses as Michael Faraday and Charles Darwin. Cambridge was ablaze in those years with young men of extraordinary talent and promise. A handful of the brightest formed the famous group known as the Apostles, and included Tennyson and his very close friend and fellow poet Arthur Hallam, who was soon engaged to Tennyson's sister. Expected to rise to the stratosphere of the British intelligentsia, Hallam died instead at the age of 22. Tennyson expressed his grief in that timeless work, In Memoriam, which took some 17 years to complete. In the final version, In Memoriam leaves behind all the nuts and bolts of Ewell's world, Ewell's science, the world of the confident scientist, and comes to grip again with the gap. Here the gap created by the death of a friend, and of all the poetry thereby withheld from the world. Here are the lines we find in section 120. I trust I have not wasted breath. I think we are not wholly brain, magnetic mockeries. Not in vain, like Paul with beasts, I fought with death. Not only cunning casts in clay, let science prove we are, and then what matter science unto men, at least to me, I would not stay. Let him, the wiser man who spring hereafter up from childhood, shape his action like the greater ape. But I was born to other things. We see then that there is this gap. It manifests itself in several ways. Perhaps most vividly it presents itself when we set out to explain how it is that mental events cause us to act, the question that will occupy us in the next lecture. Mental causation. How is it possible?